All right, our first take at Revelation Bible Study. We're giving this a go, and we're going to do an attempt at trying to at least give you a little bit of more information, maybe even a little taste test of what Revelation Bible Study might look like with the Reverend Dr. Mark Ellingsen. We're thankful for you coming in and doing this, and I'm appreciative of that because as we're trying to figure out the resources into the future, this could be a format that we use. We want more interaction, so we're going to try to figure out how to do that. And
if we get back to church, we'll finish the study that way.
We will.
You can come to Sunday school. That's the idea.
At some point in time.
We're all getting the first Sunday school class for this new sequence.
Yeah,
tonight.
a little bit of a freebie here. So,
well, when the Sunday school class wanted to do Revelation, I didn't want to. I didn't want to because it's the Lutheran in me. Martin Luther said about this book when he was young. Now, he mellowed out. But he said, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to Revelation, anybody can have their own opinion. It's a bunch of visions, and the Bible doesn't have any visions. And then he goes on to say some other nasty things. And guess what? You can get a copy of those nasty things in the office, right? How would they do that?
We're going to actually upload those onto the website. And so where this video appears, hopefully somewhere around it, there'll at least be text that points you to where you can get that, or if it's not coming off the website, email us and we'll send you a copy back.
Okay, but now he mellowed out. That's why I went along with it. And later on, when he got older, he wrote a whole commentary on it. And during the course of a Bible study on Revelation, I'll sneak some of that stuff in and let you see it too. But the question is, what the heck does this book have to do with us, except to scare us with all this talk about the end times? Well, first thing, we got to understand what it was like to live in the period when the book of Revelation is like. That's what we're going to try to do today, Tim and I. And also, we've got to clarify some misconceptions. The first thing is, we've got a lousy translation of the name of this book because the book's title is really not, Revelation isn't the English word that works best for it. Now, you all know that the New Testament wasn't written in English, right? It's written in Greek, okay? And anyway, here is the name of the book in Greek. I'm going to teach you some Greek now. But you've heard this word before, apocalypse. The apocalypse. Ziohanoi. The apocalypse of John. Gee, you've heard that word, apocalypse, haven't you? Maybe you've heard the word apocalyptic. Now, that is a fancy word for describing the end times. But not just the end of the world, a special understanding of the end of the world. That at the end, all H is going to break loose. So when the world ends, it's going to be a horrible cataclysm. And that's the title of this book. This is a book not just about Revelation. And by the way, don't say Revelations. It's Revelation. And that is it's a book that's all about the end times, and the end times are going to really be frightful, scary. Okay, so now from now on, if you don't want to call it Revelation, you're going to call it Revelation. You won't say Revelations anymore, but you're going to call it the Apocalypse, okay? And do you know what? John wasn't that, or the author of Revelation, he says he's John, he wasn't that original. He got a lot of his ideas from another book of the Bible, the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel isn't just about the lion's den. The book of Daniel is also especially about the end times too. So if you want some homework, if we start studying the first couple chapters of Revelation, the homework is you need to get your book of Daniel and read especially chapters 10 through 12. Doesn't hurt to take a look also at chapter 7 too. But do some homework on that. Okay, so that's the name of the book. But who wrote it? John, right? Yeah? Well, you decide for yourself. The book of Revelation, the book of the Apocalypse, was probably written in the late 1st century. Sometime between 81 and 96. AD. Now, you all know when Jesus was alive, when the apostles were alive, they're hanging around in the first 30 years of the Christian era, right? So, in order for John, the apostle, to have written it, he'd really have to be an old man, and they didn't have life expectancy in the first century like we do today. So, okay. But there's other reasons, you see, why a lot of New Testament scholars don't think John, the apostle, wrote it. And in order to appreciate that, we've got to know the history of the first century and before in Israel. And walk along with me and see what you think here. Who was ruling Israel in Jesus' lifetime? You all know. Rome, right? Israel was not an independent nation. But wait a minute, I'm confused. I thought Israel had its own king. How's that working out? And how did Rome get power in Israel? Now, in order to appreciate this, I'm going to ask you, I asked my students in seminary to do this with me, to get in a time machine with me. I don't want to just go on and give a lecture. I want to have you feel the feelings of these ancient Israelites. Here's how you do it. We're going to get in the time machine and get back to Jesus' day, to get back to the late first century. And you're all Hebrews now. How does it feel? How does it feel to be occupied by a foreign power? We proud Hebrews, with a Davidic monarch who had been promised that his line would lead forever, and now we're under power of Rome. Of course, we got our own king, and he supposedly is related to David, but he's nothing but a puppet. In fact, he's so much of a puppet, he doesn't even act like a Hebrew like us most of the time. He's even speaking their language a lot. He's not speaking our language anymore. So, yeah, he's our king. Yeah, he's in the Davidic line, but it just doesn't seem right. It's like the end of the world, a feeling that God might have really forfeited his promises to us. Well, how long had Rome been ruling? They took over probably sometime around 60 BC. So this had been going on for 60, 70, 80, 90 years under Roman occupation. But you know, before that, the Greeks had ruled us, or the Greek puppets. And then before that, the Persians had ruled us. Why all that had happened as long ago as 600 years? I mean, it had been over 900 years almost since Solomon sat on the throne. When is God going to deliver us? When is he coming back? Well, in Jesus' lifetime, those feelings were very much in the air. There was another reason for it. The Hebrews themselves were split. During the period of Greek rule, the Greek rulers in Israel and everywhere else, you ever hear of Alexander the Great, history freaks? He was this great Greek ruler, and he occupied Israel 300 years before Jesus, 200 years, 150 years. And Alexander had this philosophy that if I rule, the easiest way to rule foreign peoples is to turn them into ethnics like me. I, Alexander, am so proud of being Greek. Because, see, Alexander lived the same time as all the great Greek philosophers. Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. And so he felt that his culture was the greatest culture, so he was going to civilize these conquered people. That's what he did with the Jews. Do you know that he actually got a significant segment of Hebrews to forget their Hebrew language and to start speaking Greek? The technical word for that is they were Hellenized. So actually, this began almost 300 years before Jesus was born. By the time Jesus is born, Israel is really split. There are those Jews who are Hellenized, they've been Greekified, and those old-time Jews who even many of them had lost the Hebrew language and were speaking a foreign language called Aramaic, but at least they weren't adopting all those Greek ideas. Okay, that's the world Jesus and the disciples are born into. Look at, if you're watching this with somebody else right now, one of you be Hellenized and the other one be traditional. Which camp was Jesus born into? Do any of you know what your guess is? Well, let me ask you. Did Jesus speak Greek? Did the disciples speak Greek? No. The first followers of Jesus were traditional Jews who were suspicious of all those European influences on the people of Israel. Eventually, though, some of the Greek speakers began to follow Jesus too, but they were the minority. Now, in case you think that I'm just making this up, all this is in the Bible. All you have to go is to the book of Acts. See, we all knew about this big controversy in the church between Gentiles and Jewish Christians. But what a lot of us don't know is even among the Jews, they were split. They were split over this whole issue of whether or not you should become Greekified, whether or not you should become Hellenized. And so, where you want to look at is Acts 6. In Acts 6, it tells you right there, there was a meeting of disciples, and there was an increasing number of Hellenists who complained that the traditional Hebrews weren't treating them right. After all, no surprise in the church you'd have this conflict because the Hebrew people themselves were complaining. And by the way, it seems from this passage that all of the followers of Jesus, the first followers of Jesus, were Hebrews. They hadn't been Greekified. They didn't know Greek. But eventually, enough of these Greek-speaking Jews joined the church that they were able to exert some influence. And you know the story of the 7 deacons? You've heard of Stephen? Well, he's one of these 7 deacons who were appointed in this big meeting in Acts 6. But all of them have Greek names, including Stephen. And that's why you finally get, among the Hellenized Jews, some of their own leaders. But meanwhile, they're chafing. Now, what does this say, though? Jesus belonged to the party which was most resistant to foreign influence. What does that say about Christianity? The first Christians were most determined to be standoffish to foreign influence. They were not going to allow the culture to take over their way of thinking. Now, what happened to this tension? Why don't we hear about it anymore? Well, I'll tell you why. Because eventually, the Hellenized Jews, those who had been Greekified, took over the church. Why? Because, think about it, who wrote the New Testament? The New Testament is written in Greek. It couldn't have been written by Jesus' first followers or by Jesus himself because they didn't speak Greek. But it's a good thing, I'd say, for the church, that the Greek side of the Jewish community won out in the church. Because otherwise, we'd have never had the New Testament written. And without the Bible being in Greek, people in the rest of the Roman Empire might never have understood it. We might never have gotten the converts. And you and I probably then our forebears wouldn't have known anything about Christianity. Okay, that's the background. But the background I want to first of all paint for you is this suspicion of foreign influence. It's built into the very nature of Christianity. And a feeling that we can't let those foreigners take over. We can't let society shape us. We've got to be faithful to the message of God, the message of the Old Testament, the message of Jesus. Well, how about it? Have I convinced you now that the Apostle John couldn't have written Revelation? None of Jesus' followers know Greek. Does that mean we've got a forgery here in Revelation? No. Remember, there's no such thing as copyright laws in ancient times. It's perfectly okay to write something and sign your name as somebody else, as long as that somebody else is your teacher. And in ancient cultures, you have to memorize what the teacher says. It's not like today where students get to say what they think. You've got to really, if you're an ancient culture, say what the master said. And so, therefore, it's perfectly appropriate for me as a student of you to use your name in what I write, as long as I perfectly reflect your overall viewpoints. So chill out if the Apostle John didn't write the Apocalypse. That doesn't mean that it wasn't faithful to what John thought. Okay, that's basically the background that I wanted to give you today, except to tell you what's happening in the actual book of Revelation when it was written.
This is helpful. This is interesting information. One of the things I wanted to share with folks, if you want to go back a couple of years, I went on a trip, a journey to Paul's journey. It was 17 days. One of the areas we stopped was Patmos. And so the uniqueness of that island, but it is even evident when you go there. I learned a lot of things that I don't necessarily find as true, but that their perception is that John brought Mary with him, and that they have a cave that's carved out where John rested his head and had the revelation that you can go and visit. It's really interesting.
Now, the Apostle John or John, the author of Revelation?
So they don't ever clarify that, and even there's a monastery on the top of Patmos, and they tend not to want to get into that discussion, but it seemed to be it was the Apostle John, right? That because obviously how else would they brought Mary, right? But that was a conversation I had never engaged with until they were mentioning it. So
okay, one other thing before we just wrap it up that I wanted to indicate to you. Since we know all the writers of the New Testament were these Greekified Jews, that means Paul was. And he is the best example of why it's good that the Greek segment of Judaism wound up taking over the church, because isn't he the greatest evangelist? But how would Paul have been able to communicate with all these Gentiles if he didn't speak their language? Had he just been speaking Hebrew or Aramaic, the church wouldn't have grown. Okay, let's talk then about what's unique to this last book. Now, we who grew up in the church like to think that Christians were always persecuted, right? But that's false too. It's true that Jesus got killed. It's true that Peter was probably crucified or killed, and Paul, maybe the original John. But there was no program in the Roman Empire of exterminating all the Jews until much later in the first century. What the Romans are doing to Jesus and to his first followers is they're eliminating the troublemakers, right? But they're not eliminating everybody who belongs to the way. By the way, you all know that the way is the name of Christianity first. It's only later we got called Christians. But then something happened in the late first century, and this is where it's relevant for Revelation. 2 emperors began programs of systematically exterminating all Christians. But that wasn't done in Jesus' lifetime. That wasn't even done in the first couple centuries when Paul was doing his ministry. Why the change? I think you need this background to appreciate Revelation. In order to appreciate the change, you need to see how the church was changing drastically from Jesus' lifetime till about 50 or 60 AD. The first Christians are all Jews, right? And that's why Christianity is not a threat to the Roman Empire. You see, the Romans had a policy which was different from those earlier European invaders, the Greeks. Remember Alexander? And the Greeks wanted to make everybody Greek. The Romans didn't have that attitude. Their attitude was, you know what? You can rule and dominate foreign people if you give them a little semblance of freedom. That's why we Romans allowed the Hebrews to keep their king. We had him in our hip pocket. And in fact, we Romans didn't even try to enforce our religion on the people we conquered. let them play their games. Let those Hebrews believe in their Yahweh as long as it's just their God and not a God that's more powerful than our gods and the Roman Empire. And we Romans had that policy everywhere in the empire. Let the conquered people, give them a semblance of freedom, and we'll leave them alone. Okay? That's a smart, slick way of keeping them in line. But now here's the problem for the Romans. I want you to be a Roman now. Forget your Christian faith. By the way, what do we Romans think of those Christians? Well, they come from backwater part of the empire. We all know how primitive those Hebrews were anyway, and all of them are Hebrews. So, those people in Israel that follow that Jesus of theirs, that's a cult. But then what's happening is this guy Paul and these other Greek-speaking Jews who follow Jesus, they're starting to pull in some of our people, us Gentiles. And when Christianity begins to have Gentiles in its membership, it can no longer say that God, Yahweh, is just the God of the Jews. Now we've got to claim that Yahweh loves all people, that he rules over all the earth. Now put your Roman hat back on. How do you feel, Romans? We all know those Christians are a sect and a cult, and now they're even claiming that their God is greater than our gods. Oh, they're dangerous. They're delusional. And some emperors, remember, because the Romans were never that committed to their Roman gods, at least not in this period. Some of the emperors of Rome were even claiming that they themselves were God. That's how they could have the authority they had. Okay, you're a Roman citizen. You have all these beliefs. You think those Christians, the ones you know about, the ones you've heard about, they're crazy, they're nuts, and now they've gotten nuttier. Now they're even claiming that this God of theirs is the real God? Come on. Well, there is an emperor on the throne when the book of Revelation was written. And he was not the first to be shaken by these Christians making claims about this God of theirs. But then he decides finally. Some of them are even challenging the emperor's claims to being godlike. These Christians have got to be eliminated. They're a danger to the empire across the board. And so Emperor Domitian begins a systematic persecution of Christians. Sometime in his reign between 81 and 96 AD. That's the circumstances under which the book of Revelation has been written. It is especially written first to some churches in Asia, some towns in Asia, where the church had been occupied, or where the church had been founded, Well, that's where we're going to start taking up in subsequent sessions with chapter 1 and 2. You know your homework. You know which books of chapters in Daniel you're supposed to read. As far as going on with this, I don't know if you want to talk more about next steps or not, but I don't want to give lectures anymore. I want to have an engagement with you.
You want a dialogue. So what we're going to try to do is either do more of a dialogue in the midst of this with like Facebook Live, or we're exploring Zoom. There's a number of options. We didn't have that time frame to work with, but we have it now this week. So we're going to look at it. And the other option, and this would fit for this one, is just when you hear something, I want you to write it down at the end, send your questions in, and we can if we can't get it figured out how to do the dialogue live stream, even if we can't, because not everybody can make it at a certain time, with what's going on. We'll cover that again as we walk through this. And Mark, I think it's really great that we're picking up this book, because I don't know about you, but as this pandemic continues to spread, like, I know that I've heard in the back of people's minds, like, there's a locust group that's flying around, like, the concept that maybe this is the end of the world, right? And if that's in popular culture and that's what people are saying, we as Christians have something to say towards that, and maybe be better informed regarding what the 7 seals, for instance, could be, or things like that. And so I think it's very timely that we ended up picking this text and to be working through it, and hopefully, you know, at the very least, we can be discussion partners in the midst of this, because I think it'll be very helpful for you at home and us as church leaders as we try to navigate this together.
Picking up on your point, you know, actually the first Christians all thought we were at the end of the world.
Yeah.
Because after all, put yourself back in the shoes of those Hebrews. The very fact that the Davidic monarchy, that the Solomonic monarchy has been challenged by these foreign powers, the end must be in sight, because God wouldn't abandon us.
Right.
That's why the book of Daniel gets written.
Yeah.
And how about Jesus? I want all of you to read the first chapter of Mark. That's probably the most reliable, historically reliable of the Gospels, you know. And Jesus is talking all about the kingdom of God. He's sure that the kingdom is very near. And all his disciples thought that. That's why John, the writer of Revelation, wrote the kind of book he did. He's sure that the end is near. But wait a minute, that's kind of extreme, isn't it? Maybe the Romans were right about us. Are we a cult? Well, we'll talk about exactly how this book, in what sense was Jesus right that we're in the end times.
Yeah. This is
a natural for us to be talking about. I just thought of another resource. Besides, they can contact the office to get what Luther thinks about Revelation, and you can all chill out. There's a little brief survey I prepared for another book, which will just tell you a little bit and concretely about the historical background, the main sections, the main themes, and then you can, it'll be an assistance to you in reading the Revelation yourself, but you don't need it. You can read the Bible yourself, but this is just if you want a little help on that.
Yeah, because that's helpful. Thessalonians is another good one for the end of the world. When I think of that apocalyptic sort of, you know, everybody becomes lazy, right? Because they think the end of when Paul's writing, hey, get at it, like. And I think that's even helpful in the midst of this, right? If you are thinking that this is it, right? Get at serving your neighbor, because that is how we continue to live forth in faith, right?
Now, does that mean the Bible contradicts itself, though? Do we have to say they were wrong when they said were we end times, or could we really be in the end times?
Wow.
And what does that mean?
I think that sounds like a great way to bridge into our next video that we'll have next week. Again, send your comments in. We're going to be working on this. We're developing this as it goes, but hopefully in the midst of this time, you have the opportunity to dig deeper into your faith and to think through some of these things that even maybe are in the back of your head, because we'd love to help you think through them even more deeply.
And if you're shy about it, you can call me too with the questions, and I'll just use your questions that way.
Yeah, we could do it that way too if that works out better. So, all right, thanks, Mark, for doing this, agreeing to do this in the midst of this, and we'll be putting this up on YouTube, and we'll see you later.